proper frequencies through a guided subwoofer meditation, which is what we just experienced. They will also end this roundtable with another guided subwoofer meditation. So thank you to Patty and Tara. I would like to welcome you to the Locust Roundtables. As most of you know, these are a series of open format discussions and topics in contemporary art, proposed and moderated by members of the Miami art community and beyond. So thank you for coming out. And I'm just very pleased to introduce JimDrain. He's going to be working on a roundtable that we're calling I Don't Make Art When I'm Sleeping. And I'm not going to say too much more about it, but just to welcome Jim, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone. A lot of the images I'm going to show are sort of like accumulation of ideas that I haven't formulated into anything solid, but I think it just I'm sort of like opening up the box of ideas that I've been thinking about for a little bit. We're going to begin with an action with Patty and Tara. And then we'll go to my talk, and then we'll finish with Patty and Tara do an action with that. So thanks for coming, everyone.
Do you guys want to go ahead and overtime? I think we just did the action, so we'll just do you guys
Encore.
Encore.
So I'm going to start with a poem by Evelyn Dickinson. It's called Remorse is Memory Awake. Remorse is memory awake, her parties all astir. A presence of departed acts at window and at door. Its past set down before the soul and lighted with a match. Perusal to facilitate and help belief to stretch. Remorse is cureless, the disease not even God can heal. For 'tis his intuition and the adequate of hell. Apologies for getting kind of morose with this talk. But it comes from a place of looking at memory and traces of memory, I guess you could say. And there's sort of like different ideas that have sort of come together by looking at different sort of public traumas that happened in American history. And one of those is looking at the death of John F. Kennedy and sort of the consequence on Jacqueline Kennedy. And then looking at John Lennon's death and how that affected Paul McCartney. And it's sort of been a meditation for me. I don't know why this came up. I think I can sort of justify looking at my work. And so for me, a lot of times my work is about sort of like this in-between space between sort of like perceived reality and sort of like this sort of dream state so this in-between space that I'm really interested in trying to get to. And for some reason, this really speaks specifically to thoughts about Jacqueline Kennedy and sort of the ideas that I've in sort of drafts and drawings I've been sort of doing as I'm reading this book called Jackie Under My Skin. And it's by Wayne Kostenbaum, who writes about artwork a lot. And sort of the premise of the book is sort of similar, that he had like a similar experience as I had, where sort of his interests sort of come out of dreams. And for me, I kept having these dreams about Jackie Kennedy, and I didn't know what they meant. And the first dream I had was she was with JFK. I can't really say that I think about either person very much. For some reason, it came up. And in the dream, John F. Kennedy was sort of talking about the day he died and was sort of like joking about it with people. And Jackie Kennedy was really kind of morose and didn't want to talk at all. And for her, when I went up to her in the dream, was like talking. She was like, "I've had a life beyond this experience," and it's been really weird to read this book because it's sort of like, in this really kind of perverse way, this author is sort of looking at his relationship to this. He's sort of making a differentiation between like the person and the sort of idol that we have, and sort of like this sort of mass understanding of a person that we understand. And so he's sort of dissecting all these sort of points and his reflections on this one person. So these are actually through Kevin Arrow. This came about. Kevin had a trunk of Iggy Pop clothing that a friend of his had connections with. And what I did was photograph the clothing against the wall, and these were printed as photographs. This is from several years ago. So let's see how we do this. I'm just going to read excerpts from this book that sort of have to do with these images that I'm showing. So these are images that I've sort of taken of Jackie Kennedy. And they all sort of have this sort of play between public and private space. And this is what Wayne Kostenbaum talks about. What makes metaphor of Jackie's scarf and sunglasses? The scarf reminds me of X and sunglasses of Y, and then retreats from the enterprise of myth-making, wondering, is it fair, is it moral, and then remembers that celebrities in photographs harden into truism and object. The metamorphosis of Jackie in a photo is like Daphne's. She turns into a tree, a scarf, and sunglasses or bark, because she does not want to be seen, does not want to be pursued. And this image, sorry. It's really awkward. This image is by like this guy that kept pursuing Jackie Kennedy, and to the point where she actually took him to court. And for me, it was like, it really reminded me of this image where, you know, she's going into this darkness. I mean, we can kind of talk about it metaphorically just as an image. And this image itself has a lot of resonance for me. It was like one of the first paintings I saw that I remembered and really latched onto, and it's totally drawing a blank on the author, but so I kind of combined these images together, and I'm going to kind of do this throughout the talk of just sort of like having these little meditations. And then in the early 60s, there were, you know, when you were a kid and went shopping for Halloween masks, these were your options. These are the Beatles masks. And it's funny, as I was looking through all these different masks from the time period, there was a Jackie and John F. Kennedy mask, and there were Beatles masks, and everything else were these monsters. And so for me, I became interested in looking what happens. You sort of like have the choice of choosing this mythical figure to be in 1960, 1962. And Jackie Kennedy was sort of like one of these people that you could become. I'm going to talk about Warhol's sort of take on this too. So in just some dates here. So Warhol started the series on Marilyn Monroe in like the month after she died. And it's really interesting to look and see how he relates to Jackie Kennedy in the subsequent years. So this was done right after John F. Kennedy was killed. And then this was done soon after that. And I feel like what Warhol was looking at was sort of taking apart the Marilyn image, looking at this sort of celebrity idol, but then also sort of seeing it as sort of this pronouncement of death and sort of this interest in death. I'll sort of read this. This is from Thomas Crow, where he talks about this disaster series. Warhol then completed his triangle of female celebrity for the early 60s with a picture of Jacqueline Kennedy in the same basic format as the full-face portraits of Marilyn Monroe and Liz Taylor. The president's wife did not share film stardom with Monroe, but she did share the Kennedys. She also possessed the distinction of having established for the period a changed feminine ideal. Her slim, dark, aristocratic standards of beauty had made Monroe's style, and thus her power as a symbol, seem out of date even before her death. That new standard was mimicked within the Warhol circle of Eddie Sedgwick, for a time his constant companion and seeming alter ego for the period. And talking about the assassination pictures, the Kennedy assassination pictures are often seen as an exception in the artist's output, exceptional in their open emotional sincerity. But with their continuity with the best of his previous work seems just as compelling. As with the Marilyns, the loss of the real Kennedy referent galvanizes Warhol into a sustained act of remembrance. Here, however, he has a stand-in. The widow has first attracted him as an instance of celebrity typology. Again, he limits himself to fragmentary materials, take-rated news photographs out of a myriad of representations available to him. He goes on, the emotional calculus is simple, the sentiment direct and not complicated. The pictures nevertheless recognized by their impoverished vocabulary the distance between public mourning and that of the principles of the drama, out of its deliberately limited resources. The artist creates a nuance and subtlety of response that is his alone, precisely because he has not sought technically to surpass his raw material. It is difficult not to hear in this, however cynical one may become of the Kennedy's presidency or Kennedy marriage. In this particular dramatization of medium, Warhol found a room for dramatization, a feeling, and even a kind of a history plane. Anyway, what I find interesting is looking at the list of all those masks, and then looking at this Warhol painting of 9 Jackie or 16 Jackies. And the thing that I find amazing too is that the images come from before the assassination and after the assassination. And I see it as like this rumination about where she stands and what our judgment should be of her grief in a way. So this is just Tuna Disaster, just showing another image from the disaster series. Thanks for bearing with me. This is really, thank you. So maybe what I've been doing too is just looking at different videos on YouTube that sort of relate to this sort of meditation on this person.
George Washington, The Reasons of God.
And then the body was painted, and there is a beautiful Monroe centerpiece, and his flower or fruit baskets and candelabra, all brought from France in 1817. And these glasses, they're art. I wanted a very simple design so that the china and silver and glass would show up more. So I looked all over the prettiest ones I found here in West Virginia.
Well, they are beautiful.
And then this tablecloth is new. It's a gift to the White House and the firm of Porto. And it's all embroidered in gold to match the centerpiece and the knife and fork.
And these pictures, there are 3 of them in this room, the 2 behind us here.
Yes, these 2 were on loan from the Boston Museum of Fine Art. All 3 pictures in this room by Healy. There's Thomas Jefferson, a copy after Stewart. And then there's Daniel Webster, who didn't live here, but he visited the White House for 40 years. And then the most famous one of all is this one of Abraham Lincoln, which traditionally always hung in the state dining room. Healy was a contemporary of Lincoln, but he only saw him once. So he painted this picture from photographs. And you can see 2 damaged spots on it, really quite bad ones. So we hope soon to have all the pictures in the White House that need repair repaired.
This is a perfectly beautiful room. Have you changed it a great deal?
No, we painted it white. This room's interesting because it has the most architectural unity of any room in the White House. It's really all 1902, when Theodore Roosevelt did the great restoration with Stanford White and his firm, McKinley & White. The architecture, the consoles with the eagles, the furniture, the chandelier, and the athletes.
I'm just going to show a segment of that just to give a sense of Dr. Kennedy. I have 2 more videos of her, and then I'm first going to read this about what Wayne Kosovan talks about with the 9 Marylands. Warhol rendered Jackie celebrity victim in his standard grid, repeating images as if they were mugshots, frames of documentary film footage, or fan clippings. Repetition implies mourning. The Damascene is a trauma. The mourning takes the form of recycling and recall, a process that unsettles chronology. Images of Jackie before and after Jackie's death get jumbled. Repetition implies commodification. Jackie no longer has control over her own image, nor do we as consumers. For it is dispersed in culture with a rapidity and vehemence that do not obey the laws of individual desire. And repetition implies obsession. The Jackie photos are cropped, narrowing the focus onto Jackie's alone, myopically isolating her from the context. In Warhol's 16 Jackies, she's alone in a hall of mirrors, kind of like Rita Hayworth in the final scene of The Lady of Shanghai. Lonely Jackie is trapped among reflections of herself without companion. Through the Warhol silkscreen announced, though the Warhol silkscreen announces no individual or psychological point of view, it seems to erase individuality. Its technique underscoring the inhuman process of mass media reproduction betrays the emotions of a saint maker. To repeat Jackie 16 times requires energy, momentum, and love. Andy evidently cared enough about Jackie to multiply her, or else her aura was tenuous and it needed bolstering through multiplication. One could never get deeper into her experience. One could only repeat the faint flow and hope to acquire a vivid Jackie through solid accretion.
Queridos amigos, les habla la esposa del senador John F. Kennedy, candidato a la presidencia de los Estados Unidos. En estos tiempos de tanto peligro, cuando la paz mundial se ve amenazada por el comunismo, es necesario tener en la Casa Blanca un líder capaz de guiar nuestros destinos con una mano firme. Mi esposo siempre vigilará los intereses de todos los sectores de nuestra sociedad que necesitan la protección del gobierno humanitario para el futuro de nuestros niños y para lograr un mundo donde exista la paz verdadera. Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. ¡Que viva Kennedy!
To express my appreciation for the hundreds of thousands of messages, nearly 800,000 in all, which my children and I have received over the past few weeks. The knowledge of the affection in which my husband was held by all of you has sustained me, and the warmth of these tributes is something I shall never forget. Whenever I can bear to, I read them. All these bright light going from your world. All of you who have written to me know how much you really love them, and with you return that love in full measure. It is my greatest wish that all of these letters be acknowledged. They will be, but it will take a long time to do so, but I know you will understand. Each and every message is to be treasured, not only for my children, but so that future generations will know how much our country.
I'm just going to read one more passage and then I'll go to the Paul McCartney videos. But for me, it's not about sort of exploring someone's sadness or their grief. I think it can get really kind of tacky to do that. It's more, for me, the interest is sort of like looking at this space of where someone is presenting a persona and then all of a sudden this disaster or trauma sort of prevents them from sort of like throws a curveball and they can't really sort of understand their position and sort of like they're sort of trapped in this in-between space. And I think that you see this in the Paul McCartney videos pretty clearly. But I'll just end with this one. And I think this sort of describes sort of like sort of witnessing this sort of this trauma happening to someone else and sort of like not knowing how we are supposed to react to it or what kind of judgment we have or what our relationship is to this. We know factually that Jackie is innocent, a traumatized victim. We also may feel irrationally that she is connected to the loss of the head of state. Of course, Jackie did not kill her husband, Jack. Yet her presence alive beside his dying body, accords her ambiguous, inexplicable power. The living woman next to a dead man, a pieta, is a uniquely satisfying, horrifying icon to contemplate. Because the two have been brought to an even level. The man cannot rule now, cannot move mountains, cannot cure lepers. It is the woman's turn to be heroic, to incite worship, and to rule. It might be in poor taste to give voice to these reflections on Jackie's symbolic complicity with JFK's death, or at least the illusion and pictures that Jackie is linked to his beheading in quotes. But images of Jackie fascinate us, so because her face and the retinue of scenes it conjures evoke shameful, irrational undercurrents, as if Jackie's image contaminated by JFK's blood in turn contaminates us.
Spent the day at an Oxford Street studio saying, "Work is the best time." Police were standing by along with reporters as McCartney finished. How was your reaction to the death of the That's very shocking. It's terrible news. What were you recording today? I was just listening to some stuff. I just didn't want to say it out. Why? Look, I didn't feel like it. What time did you hear the news? 6 in the morning sometime. Very early? Yeah. Okay, cheers. The survivor of the most successful songwriting team in history also said, John will be remembered for his unique contribution to art, music, and world peace. This is John Lawrence in London, another of John Lennon's former...
So, imagine your best friend, it's horrible to even think about, has just died and you're in the studio essentially to hide away, and you don't want to see the press, and you come out, and they're just like surrounding you and want a piece of you, and essentially to consume the news. And you just see the amount of grief that is on his face, and the only thing that he says is like, what is it? It's like such a drag. And he was pounced on that amazingly. So this next interview is him talking about that.
So, it was, obviously I was like probably more shattered than most people when John died. And I had plenty of sort of personal grief, but I'm not very good at public grief. So someone thrust a microphone into my face and said, what's your comment? Now all the other pundits came out with great comments. Well, John will be sorely missed. He sounds like there's somebody that, all I could muster was that bit of drag. And it was like, I couldn't say anything else about that. I just couldn't. We all had jokes, but nobody came out with any big comments because it was too dear to us. It was just too much of a shock. But of course, then that got reprinted. McCartney, when asked for his Lennon's death, said, it's a drag. And it comes out like that, you just got to be so careful.
So this is from Susan Sontag's regarding the pain of others. This is not quite the same as asking people to remember a particularly monstrous thought of evil, never forget. Perhaps too much value is assigned to memory, not enough to thinking. Remembering is an ethical act, has ethical value in and of itself. Memory is, vacantly, the only reaction we have with the dead. So the belief that remembering is an ethical act is deep in our natures as humans, who know we are going to die, and who will mourn those in the normal course of things die before us, grandparents, parents, teachers, and older friends. Heartlessness and amnesia seem to go together, but history gives contradictory signals about the value of remembering in a much larger span of collective history. There is simply too much injustice in the world, and too much remembering she gives an example that in bitters, to make peace is to forget, to reconcile, it is necessary that memory be faulty and limited. So I'm going to show this, and my talk is going to be done. Again, thank you for everyone for coming. So this video is just like, I guess I was looking for some kind of reaction that Paul McCartney would have to John Lennon's death, and this is the video that I think sort of says it all without saying anything. So.
Bill's called Christopher.
Guess we don't want to do that. It's funny too, is like, so I was just cruising on YouTube, and it says Paul McCartney cries after John Lennon's death, and actually he doesn't cry in this video. It's really sad this one.
There's two girls called Chris and Val, and they used to say, sing stage, sing stage. That used to be a big regret. Chris and Val, sing stage. That was me and George did that bit. And John said to leave.
Discomfort he has in listening to this music, of like being aware of the camera looking at him, but also just being able to engage with the song at such an incredible level, and you just see the vulnerability of Paul McCartney happening in this video. Anyway, so again, thanks for coming. Hopefully, this is sort of more about asking questions than sort of like defining answers right now for me. So it's been nice just to be able to open up this kind of thought, sort of Pandora's box that I've been thinking about. Anyway, thanks for coming. the one with the Jackie books?
Yeah, that one.
It's called Jackie Under My Skin Wing. He's like an art writer, but for some reason wrote this book about Jackie.
And he was the one that touched on the masks and the Warhols and the death. Like, he was making that bridge specifically between the Warhol, Jackie's, and her actual grief.
Well, he talks, I mean, it gets kind of perverse because he talks about like her hairdos as being these sort of helmets of protection and her outfits, the different sort of outfits that she wears that really kind of like upstages Jack Kennedy at the time. And I was looking at the Warhol, it made me look at the Warhol paintings again and just sort of see them in terms of the way Wayne Kostenbaum was talking about it, and seeing them in terms of like sort of like this veil. Just seeing all these images that were coming up too of like sort of like this veil of Jackie Kennedy and how she was so known for like avoiding press and sort of veiling herself, but also it was like this sort of play between sort of being available and as a first lady, but also removing herself and sort of having her own life after being a widow and marrying Mr. Onassis, and then people's judgment of that, calling her Jackie O is sort of like it was actually in some ways like what's the word, like Jackie O was like
Almost like a fetish.
kind of a diss in some way.
Yeah.
Say a diss?
Yeah. I think in the beginning it was like Jackie O, like, and Wayne talks about that of like, oh Jackie, what are you doing? And kind of like, just sort of like this public judgment of like, and I think that sort of reflects on that thing where, it's like she's obviously did not kill her husband, but it's sort of like all this judgment of her being in that place and not, it's sort of like we're connecting with our inability to change history and sort of not how this person died and sort of affected so many things.
She was mourning so gracefully and publicly too. I mean, she was this style icon and people I think didn't want to see that mourning period end, and they knew that what was happening when she married Onassis. It was like the grieving was over, right. And they kind of wanted, I think, to cling to the mourning Jackie.
There's a lot of
that happened to Jackie.
Yeah. But it's interesting, like you said, that mourning kind of character became something else entirely other than her. And like you said, the masks that you can buy, you get monsters, and then you get these.
Right, it sort of happened before, when she was the first lady. It was like this happened of sort of making her into this monster in some way, or something equivalent to a monster. I mean, it happens now where I think a lot more in terms of celebrity culture, demonizing someone, but while you're sort of praising at the same time.
I have a question. How do you comprehend?
Hello. Hi, my name is Lenka. How do you comprehend people for whom they are, people for the fact that we die?
Well, when I first was asked to do this talk, I really, I was sort of like thinking of these ideas, and I didn't connect it to things that I was talking to you about. Sort of like the title of the talk is like I don't make art when I'm sleeping, but it's sort of dreams that inform my work a lot. But in some ways, I wanted to talk about sort of like the space where we could be human beings as well as artists, and I feel like this sort of like this. In some ways, the more I thought about it, like it seemed to really reflect on that idea of like where do we find the space for reflection, where we're artists, but we're not necessarily making anything, and we can sort of look back and sort of delve into like what does it mean to delve into like things that already sort of are present within ourselves, and it's sort of like this backward movement, like creation. I think oftentimes is seen as like this forward movement ahead, and like you're constantly sort of having this output. So how do you sort of balance that of really having the time for reflection and sort of making it an artist? I don't know if that really answers your question so much, but I think it's more about understanding humanity and seeing humanity in a person and sort of understanding what an icon is and like what the process of that culture kind of does no matter what. Like, I think we can't really demonize culture for making people into icons. I think we've done it from the beginning of time. It's maybe sort of like understanding a person's humanity separate from that, and it's really hard to negotiate that, I think.
I had thoughts about sympathy and humanity, so they appreciate people for the fact, well, all the time you're very sympathetic towards everybody or for their achievements or related to our values. Those are the topics that my thoughts are revolving around.
I think the interesting thing about Warhol's images is that the paintings of Jacqueline Onassis didn't die when she died. They still have presence and importance now in culture, and I think it's going to be different in 100 years from now. And I think that's what's interesting as an artist is like when you make it work, like it has a shelf life in some way and a relevance, and it's one of the fascinating things for me as an artist is like seeing how that changes over time too. Where the biggest thing this year is going to be like something out the next year, this kind of fashion sort of cycle. It's really just a part of sort of like this evolution of ideas. Some things sort of stick and some things don't. And, so I think it goes beyond our own sort of mortality in a way, where these ideas sort of exist without, Islam, ideas sort of like don't have this mortality that we have.
Mm-hmm. There's like a degree of production involved in both of those things, like producing producing it, whether it's an icon or a way that things are, or a trend, or there's an element to producing that. But I want to turn this back to
I don't need to microphone. Obviously, you're pretty talented considering the passing of Miss Doubtfire. Do you find something fascinating about the current medium that like people are allowed to sort of express public grief and despair in? Something like Instagram or that is very like controlled, something like Twitter compared to Paul being like kind of cornered as he's coming out of the studio. People are basically allowed to now kind of control the message that comes out and that reflects it all the time about public despair and grief.
I think maybe it's not an exception for me, but I found out about Robin Williams dying through Instagram. Like someone posted, I was like, why is someone posting this Doubtfire or not? Like, considering their feed, it didn't make sense within their feed, and it was like, and then I Googled CNN, and it was like, oh, this makes sense. And like that outpouring of images of, I don't know if everyone uses Instagram, but like seeing Robin Williams all over the place the past couple of days has been amazing. Because I don't know if I'm as invested in this as everyone else is, or as other people are. But, I think there's an immediacy now with Instagram where we're sort of like understand the sort of like collective grief and mourning that's possible, and or celebration and joy. And in some ways, I don't think it's different from what it was in 1962. Just it moves at a different speed, maybe.
Do you think about your own work in terms of wanting to limit its having a shelf life by engaging in what you consider to be themes that go beyond kind of a fascination that is current or that is something of the 90s or something limited like that?
I remember a teacher of mine when I was in school was like, don't react to things, just like don't be reactionary when you make work. But I think being spontaneous to something doesn't necessarily mean that it's not really effective. And it's sort of like if you look at the production of artwork in terms of like evolutionary biology or something, it's like you don't know which species is going to survive in some way. It's like who would have thought that the mouse would have, or like this tiny little mammal would have survived compared to like a T-Rex or something. So it's like the conditions are never predictable, and so it's hard to say like whether we should be reactionary or not. and what it's going to be effective in the long run. But I think for me, like having this sort of like reflective process and sort of like looking at maybe trying to look at the collective understanding or collective consciousness is maybe one way of just sort of like getting to something, you know, like everyone can read when you're dishonest, and you can kind of like tell if someone's kind of snaky or not telling the truth, right? So it's about getting to sort of like a truth that is true for you, and I think that leads to other people as well. And so really it's about, I think, more about getting to that place, whether that's reactionary or reflective or whatever.
It's also connected, I think, to how you navigate between the audience of yourself and the perceived audience that you have that you project your work into.
Yeah, I mean, actually, misunderstandings between yourself and your audience are actually kind of fruitful things too.
How so?
Actually, Warhol talks about that. Of like, actually, misunderstanding things is better than trying to understand things. And I think the role of the artist is oftentimes to create problems, and misunderstandings always create problems. And so I think misunderstandings are actually a really fruitful thing.
When you say that, if you don't mind, are you speaking, kind of looking back, that you say, well, that was at the time a dead end, but here, reviewing it 2 months later, 2 years later, I see that by screwing that up totally, I got out of a rut and moved on to something else? Or are you speaking about creating problems or mistakes intentionally in the moment?
Maybe both. I think you can create problems for yourself and they become problems. But I think oftentimes you can do things without having an understanding of the meaning of why you're doing it, and the meaning can come afterwards too. And sort of maybe not putting up blocks against, moving forward if you don't quite understand what's going on. It's sort of just following your gut. And, that could lead to a lot of misunderstandings and problems. But I do think that I'm just thinking about a teacher that sort of recommended that too. Power range fairness. He just was saying that, the meaning can come after you actually make something. It doesn't matter if you understand it or not.
It can also be being ambitious, not in a commercial sense, but going beyond what you feel competent to do, can create, is more likely to create a problem or an unsuccessful piece or series than doing something that you've more or less mastered. But as a consequence of that, you're liable to stumble into some new territory rather than staying where you're already comfortable.
I totally agree. Like looking at someone like Agnes Martin, where it's hard to see where she was taking risks or where this sort of problematic thing can happen with her. And it's really great to like look at a person's span of their career and see like where, with Warhol too, like what he was doing by making these Japanese portraits. Like looking at, he did this series of disasters that came after Marilyn Monroe. And you see in this questioning, am I looking at celebrity? Am I looking at this fascination with death? And so like he went both ways, where he did the portrait of Jackie Kennedy, just the red, Kennedy, and then he also did one with Liz Taylor. And then, he kind of circled back on that with the portraits in the 70s too. I think when you look at Warhol's work, you see all these questions sort of popping up where it seems like he understood everything as he was going forward, but you see a lot of questioning and sort of doubts that happen as he's making this work, and I think it's really this series of Jackie images, I think, are really specific. You know, where he's really kind of questioning how to go forward. You know,
how to go forward in terms of like presenting an authentic image, or
like where his interests are, whether it's in celebrity or his fascination with death. You know, he did like the electric chair, did like 129 die, this image of this plane crash. You know, it's sort of like this. People see it as sort of like this tangent that he went on, but for me, it's like the core of his work. Where there's also like a celebration of celebrity, but I think he sees the sort of like the darker side of what building an icon is. I think that you see that especially with disasters.
right, building that icon. Hi, Liz. Do you want to pass that back to that? Sorry.
Oh, I don't need that.
Thank you, Jim.
Is that sort of how the interest is to you in terms of these figures? So you're looking at Paul McCartney in relation to John Lennon's death, and then you're looking at Jackie Kennedy in relation to Paul Lauren, which obviously has this big relation to JFK's death. Is the sort of the death or the mourning or the grief, is that like a crack in the facade of the icon for you, or?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. Is where you see it versus humanity in this moment, where they sort of like Paul McCartney had this sort of bubbly persona that he suddenly couldn't hold that up anymore, and didn't sort of like had no place to sort of like identify himself in this grief, and you see the awkwardness of this and trying to like describe this to himself as well as to the public, you know.
And are you looking at any other figures sort of in a similar way? Is it just Jackie O and Jackie Kennedy and Paul McCartney, or have you got other people that you're looking at too?
This is it right now. I'm interested if you know it.
Okay.
Well, Liz, I would ask you like to bring it back to like Susan Sontag, and I'm sorry, because unless anyone else is interested in talking about Susan Sontag, but I mean, my understanding, you know, in a very Susan Sontag-like approach is, right, she's looking at the ways in which we look at grief and death and make a distance from ourselves and it, whereas it's not that. Am I butchering this?
I have no idea.
Okay. Does anyone have the Sontag background here?
You can say whatever you want.
Right. So, I mean, essentially, there's this theory of distance where we look at these images and we consider them as other, and we don't offer them the humanity that they actually deserve. And that's kind of, in a weird way, it's almost like it's sort of like in reverse to the Paul McCartney cracking his idol and becoming more humanized. Like it's, I'm just interested in those two different constructions of that. So I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that.
Well, I guess there's popular that there's like collective grief, like probably what we're all feeling about Robin Williams, and like Princess Diana, and there's personal grief, like what Prince William and Prince Harry had about their mother dying. I guess is that kind of what you're?
Well, right, but also like the grief that when we look at that, like that popular video of Paul McCartney crying, you know, we're interested in that both because, you know, we're interested in that for complicated reasons, both because it is collective and also because it is personal, and maybe that's a weird place that.
Just kind of speaking off the cuff. So like we're looking for, like we want to sort of, we have this collective grief for a person, and sort of like if we have more insight into our own grief by seeing Paul McCartney express his grief about John Lennon, and it's sort of like this. We're sort of given this more intimate space to express our own grief in some way. But, you know, it's sort of like with Jackie Kennedy or Jackie Onassis, it's like we're have an idea of what her grief should be in some way, and
people want her to grieve in a specific way.
Right, and she's holding sort of her own identity separate from the public, and it's sort of like people, it's like a need a need to consume grief in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's this hunger to sort of express our grief.
Yeah.
And she was kind of refusing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just, these kinds of things really make me think of like Thomas Hirschhorn, like the Crystal, where you have, all these intense images that are terrible that everyone can recognize as being really, grief-stricken, but yet he wants everyone to shuffle in and see all of them and experience them, and there's a weird difference between witnessing someone's grief and then witnessing images that inspire grief.
Not a big Thomas Hirschhorn.
I really know.
Well, isn't that also part of what a crucifixion, the purpose of a crucifixion?
To inspire empathy.
Yeah,
right, in a public and private way simultaneously. And that ceremonies and buildings are established in order to prescribe ways that we can enter into a way of expressing and relating to a feeling that's personal, but with the support of a structure. Maybe it's in part physical structure, and also people who are dressed in black or white or whatever the appropriate thing
and
is
also
in the
to
culture.
further narrative too, and teach lessons and further narrative also.
You referred to this process as a meditation, and I'm wondering how much deeper you're going into that. So you take your dreams and you're kind of allowing your subconscious to lead you some way, and then you get to these masks, and then you compare the mask to the face. And I'm wondering if there are other kind of exercises that you're doing in order to allow the subconscious to come out and guide you beyond dreams or beyond kind of a, I don't know, like more maybe conventional meditation or anything like that.
For me, it's just been keeping a dream journal and sort of like analyzing the dreams I'm having. So like this Jackie Kennedy dream was like sort of part of that too. And I was like, trying to understand. I still don't quite understand where that dream came from. And so, yeah, doing these sort of exercises, looking at the masks, are sort of like part of sort of analyzing that and sort of like looking at those conscious in a way that maybe can sort of inform what I'm thinking. It's like, but besides, I think these exercises and reading more about Jackie Kennedy, that's kind of the extent of where I am right now on this.
Were the masks something that also came from a dream or in some kind of meditative state, or was that your decision?
I think I was looking at these veils that Jackie Kennedy was wearing that were all images and seeing them as masks in a way. And it was sort of described that way in this book. And so that's why I was like, well, let's look at Halloween masks and then at that time period, what can that do to inform me about this? It's just looking at curiosity, I guess, that I was found that. So. Yeah, that's why I thought it was interesting that the only two human masks at that time period were like the Beatles and Jackie Kennedy.
Yeah, it's amazing.
The only two what's, I'm sorry?
Like human masks that were manufactured from like the Beatles. I mean, I could please prove me wrong. Those are the ones that came up looking at these masks. Cool. Yep.
This isn't really like a question, but I guess like there's like put my thoughts out there. But I think it's really interesting to explore a narrative like this, and you made like a lot of references to kind of like enlightenment periods, like I think like ways of exploring it, and I think I've like, heard a lot about like the David and how Michelangelo's David became such an icon versus like Bernini's David or Donatello's David. You know, Donatello's being close to slaying Goliath and Bernini's being in action, and technically probably a better sculpture. But, you know, Michelangelo's David persists because he has that vulnerability still. But like the moment before,
That's a really good point.
The one having vulnerability and one.
Like Lando's having vulnerability because he hadn't thrown the stone yet, you know? And he's like sitting there punching also. Even like Warhol, you know, reference stuff. He gave much more of an icon than the other soldiers.
Yeah, his awkwardness is like so, you just like immediately empathize with this figure that's so like awkward and gangly. Whereas the other, like Tom Charles and Raphael's are more triumphant. And sort of like it's more like an open book in some way. Where the other stories are sort of closed, like, oh, he did kill the giant. And this one, it's like this apprehension about this action that's going to happen. It's really good point. Cool.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.